Hi, good morning. My name is Dean Bonner, and I'm the Associate Survey Director and a Research Fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their government. This survey was conducted with funding from the R.J. and Francis Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation, and we thank them for their support. We also thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for supporting this virtual event. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, nor does it support or oppose any positions, any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, I will walk through some of the key findings from the survey, talk a little bit about some of the main takeaways, and then I will answer some of your questions. If you do have a question about the survey, I encourage you to send an email and include your name and organization to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now I will transition to my briefing. So prior to kind of getting into the details of this survey, I just want to talk a little bit about the mission of the PPIC survey, and that's to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data. We then use that data to inform policymakers, encourage discussion, and raise awareness on critical issues of the day. In doing so, we hope to provide a voice for the public as well as for likely voters. And since 1998, we've actually completed about 200 surveys and provided a voice for over 400,000 Californians. This particular survey is part of the Californians and their government series. This series has touched upon state and national issues and dates back to 1999. This particular survey looks at public perceptions and attitudes as well as policy preferences on issues on both state and national issues. The survey was fielded in early March in the days following the Russian military invasion of Ukraine, and as Californians faced both rising prices at the pump as well as increasing prices on consumer items. This time period was one in which COVID-19 cases had plummeted and the Omicron surge had given way to an easing of mask and vaccination requirements. The survey was conducted on both cell phones and landlines, and we talked to just shy of 1,700 Californians, and about 1,200 of those we deemed as likely voters. And now let's turn to some of the interesting findings from the report. So in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a majority of Californians, including majorities across parties, support sanctioning Russia, even if it means higher energy prices. And while partisans support these sanctions, Democrats are much more likely than independents or Republicans to support sanctions overall, and if it means higher energy prices. And there are also some noticeable differences across regions and demographic groups. We find that San Francisco Bay Area residents are the most likely, and Inland Empire residents are the least likely to support these sanctions, even if higher energy costs. And support for sanctions in the face of potentially higher energy prices increases sharply with rising educational attainment and household income. So even prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Californians were facing rising consumer prices associated with inflation. And this month, when we asked Californians specifically if recent price increases had caused them and anyone in their family financial hardship, we find that about a third of Californians and nearly half of lower income Californians say these increases have caused them serious financial hardship. There's a partisan divide on this as well, with Republicans and independents more likely than Democrats to say that they've experienced hardship. Notably, Californians with children 18 and under in their household are more likely than those without to say that they have experienced serious hardship. And beyond rising gas prices, as well as rising consumer prices, housing expenses are of concern to Californians. Today, we find that just over half of Californians say they're concerned about having enough money to pay for their rent or mortgage. And 1 in 4 are saying that they are very concerned. The share saying they are very concerned declines with rising income and is twice as high among renters than homeowners. It's noteworthy that despite the San Francisco Bay Area having some of the highest housing costs in California and in the US, concern about paying for housing is lowest across regions in the San Francisco Bay Area. And similar to the impact with rising prices, we find that those with children in their household are much more likely to be concerned about having enough money to pay for rent or mortgage than those without. And turning to a question that often generates a lot of attention, today we find a record high share of Californians saying that they're seriously considering moving away from their part of California. And most of those who are considering the move would move outside of the state. Once again, not to sound like a broken record, but there is this wide partisan divide on this, with the majority of Republicans and independents saying they have considered moving away, compared to just 1 in 3 Democrats. And it's notable that if we look back to prior to the pandemic in February 2020, the share of Republicans who are considering moving away from their part of the state has increased by 15 points. Among other groups, we find that renters, younger Californians, those with kids under 18, and more affluent Californians are more likely than others to say that they are considering moving away from their part of California. Turning to another issue that has been persistent in recent years, we find a record high 63% of Californians say that the presence of homeless people in their community has increased. This view is widely held across regions, and more than 6 in 10 across parties and demographic groups have say that the presence of homeless people has increased in the area that they live. And if we compare this to 2019, we're seeing double-digit increases among Democrats and independents, while the share of Republicans who say that the presence of homeless has increased has stayed about the same. And while we are seeing people saying that the presence of homeless people is increasing, it's interesting that we also find that the share of Californians who are very concerned about the presence of homeless people has been declining. So if we go back to 2019, we see a drop of 12 points among Californians, and as well as double-digit increases across most demographic groups when it comes to whether or not they're concerned or worried about the presence of homeless people. One of the biggest drops across regions came in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a region that is often noted for its homeless problem. Notably, those who say the presence of homelessness has increased, and those who say that homelessness is a problem in their community, they're far more likely than others to say that they're very concerned about the presence of homeless people. So this is just an interesting finding. It is noteworthy that while we've seen a drop among men and among women, the drop is greater among men. And today we find that women are 9 points more likely than men to say that they're worried about the presence of homeless people in their community. So turning to COVID-19, 2 years after the shelter-in-place order, we find that 8 in 10 Californians say that the worst of the pandemic in the U.S. is behind us. This is marked improvement from February when 2 and 3 held this view, but not quite at the level of optimism that we saw in May 2021 prior to the Delta variant emerging. This view is widely held, with 7 in 10 across parties, regions, and demographic groups saying the worst is behind us at this point in time. In a separate question, we find that about 2 in 3 Californians are not at all concerned that they will get COVID and require hospitalization at this time. If we compare that to last March, just 52% of Californians were not at all concerned at that point in time. And with California and the US perhaps headed into a new endemic stage of the virus, how are Californians viewing the need to control the spread of COVID-19? So today we find that a solid majority, including nearly half that feel this way strongly, prefer trying to control the spread of the coronavirus, even if it means having some restrictions on normal life, while 3 in 10 prefer having no restrictions, even if it hurts efforts to control the spread. As with most things related to COVID, and most things seemingly in the world today, there's a partisan divide, with Democrats preferring an approach which prioritizes controlling the spread, while Republicans prioritizing lack of restrictions. We also find that men and women view this differently, as well as those with and without kids in the household. And while majorities across regions prefer the approach that would control the spread, even if it means some restrictions, residents in the San Francisco Bay Area are the most likely to say this. And changing topics, and now looking at the upcoming midterm election, today we find that 4 in 10 likely voters say that voting in this year's midterm is more important than in previous years, while about half say it's about the same. In March 2018, so at the same time frame leading up to the 2018 midterm elections, half of California's likely voters were saying that voting that year was more important than in previous years. Today, we find this real gap between Republicans and Democrats, as well as independents, when it comes to how important this voting in this election will be. Notably, in March 2018, we actually found the reverse, with 6 in 10 Democrats compared to about 4 in 10 Republicans saying that voting was more important. So there's really been a change there. And some of this has to do with who's holding the office of the presidency and what happens at this first midterm election. We also find that a majority of likely voters in Democratic and Republican-held House districts, as well as in those in districts viewed as competitive by the Cook Political Report, see that voting is about the same as in previous years. The importance of voting is about the same. Across regions, we find that half of likely voters in Orange, San Diego say that voting this year is more important, compared to about 4 in 10 likely voters elsewhere. This is noteworthy because some of the House districts down in Orange and San Diego and Southern California have actually played a role and garnered a lot of national attention when it comes to who's going to be able to control the House of Representatives. And when it comes to who likely voters might support in the 2022 midterm election for the House of Representatives, today we find that about half said that they would vote or lean towards the Democratic candidate, while just over 4 in 10 say that they would prefer a Republican. These findings pretty closely mirror what we found in March of 2018. And in true fashion, most Democrats would prefer the Democratic candidate, while most Republicans would prefer the Republican candidate. And while not as strong as partisanship, we do find that 6 in 10 likely voters in Democratic held seats would support the Democrat, and about 6 in 10 likely voters in Republican-held seats would actually prefer the Republican. And we look at some other groups, we find that women are more likely than men to prefer the Democratic candidate, while about half across income groups prefer the Democrat. And this preference for supporting of a Democratic candidate in the 2022 House elections increases sharply with educational attainment. So this month, as you can see, we asked about the approval of many elected officials, as well as approval of the state legislature and Congress. So today we find that a majority of Californians approve of Governor Newsom, their own state representative, as well as their own House representative. Today, about half, or right at half of Californians approve of President Biden, while the state's 2 senators have the approval of about 4 in 10 Californians. Across all of these groups, we find that across all of these approval ratings, we find that approval of Congress receives the lowest approval at 37%. It is noteworthy that approval of Congress has actually increased 5 points since February. So while they're still the lowest, their standing has improved. And in general, across all of these approval ratings, Democrats are much more approving than Republicans, and approval tends to be higher in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles than elsewhere. And for the most part, across all of these, we find that approval is very similar to approval in recent months, dating back to February, as well as that all the way back to September. But there is one exception, and that's President Biden. So if we look back to where approval has gone for President Biden, what we find, and this is comparing approval to last March, so not even to last January, right after he was elected or put into office, and where his approval was slightly higher. But since last March, we've seen approval drop 15 points among all adults, 14 points among likely voters. There's also been a double-digit drop among Democrats and Republicans. And while the drop is only 9 points among Republicans, his approval actually fell by nearly half, from 20% to 11%. And there was a 20-point drop across all regions of the state, except in Los Angeles, where approval of President Biden saw an 8-point decline. And across demographic groups, President Biden's approval has dropped by double digits across all of these groups. Our survey covered a lot of other topics, and so I encourage you to both look at the report itself, which is online, as well as at the crosstabs and time trends that we have online as well. And some of these other topics includes views on the state and local tax system, preferences for state government spending, support for vaccine mandates to enter certain spaces, as well as attitudes towards getting the COVID-19 vaccine, views on potential reforms to the California recall process, as well as perceptions of race relations in America today. And I did want to note before kind of opening up, well, first let me say, if you do have a question about anything I said or saw in the report, please submit questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. But I did want to kind of talk about a few items that I think are important when it comes to this survey. What we're seeing at this current point in time is that we've seen a lot of stability when it comes to elected officials at the state level, particularly Gavin Newsom as his approval of governor. Today, his approval among all adults is at 56%. It's been above 50% since January 2021. And so it's very steady. And we've also seen approval of the state legislature, which has been hovering right about half for quite a while now. But we're also seeing a national level that approval where there has been some fluctuation of Congress, as well as what I just illustrated with approval of President Biden. And so what we're seeing here is that President Biden has really seen this precipitous drop, some of this being tied to inflation and rising gas prices. And beyond that, sometimes we ask about a survey question and then something happens in the real world right after. And so this is kind of a good example, is that we asked about whether or not Californians favored or opposed requiring proof of vaccination to enter large outdoor gatherings or certain indoor spaces. And as you might know, this was actually, there was recently an announcement by the state that certain large gatherings, there would no longer be the requirement beginning on April 1st to actually either show a negative test or proof of vaccination. However, in our question, which specifically asks about large outdoor gatherings or certain indoor areas like restaurants, bars, or gyms, we actually find that about 6 in 10 Californians are still favoring this. We've also seen that some of the areas that had instituted these requirements, San Francisco recently, as well as Los Angeles in the coming days or weeks, have also taken this down. This requirement down. But it is noteworthy that at least half across regions actually support proof of vaccination to enter some of these spaces. So it's noteworthy that it seems like the state is acting in a way that is, while supported by good data and public health, that the public would actually still be okay if these requirements were still in place, at least some of the public. We find that 7 in 10 Democrats favor this idea of proof of vaccination, compared to just 1 in 4 Republicans and about half of independents. And so once again, I just want to encourage you to share, to submit any questions that you may have to PPIC event questions @gmail.com. And now I will anxiously await any questions that you may have. All right, and it looks like we do have our first question. So it says that California's recovery from COVID downturn is affecting regions across the state in different ways. Does your survey support, need better glasses, I suppose. Does your survey point to any variations by regions in terms of economic outlook or standing? Well, what we do find is that while we didn't ask about our economic outlook, we did ask how Californians are dealing with recent price increases. And what we see is that there is a range there. While it's lowest in the San Francisco Bay Area at 29%, and the perception that financial hardship, that price increases are causing financial hardship, is actually highest in the Inland Empire at 45%. And so there is some variation across regions. We find that 40% in Orange San Diego say that they're also experience serious financial hardship. So looking for another question. So the survey shows that concerns about getting seriously ill from COVID are down from a year ago. What about among particularly at-risk groups like older Californians? That's a great point, because while the concern overall is down, there are some groups that are still more concerned than others. In particular, the youngest of Californians, 18 to 34, just 3 in 10 say that they're concerned at all about getting the coronavirus, and only 9% that say they're very concerned at this time. When we look at those 55 and older, we actually find that 38% are concerned and 15% are actually very concerned. There's also regional variation. Folks down in Orange San Diego, 37% say they are concerned about getting the coronavirus and requiring hospitalization, with 21% being very concerned. And that fluctuates all the way down to 31% in the Inland Empire, where we see that 19% are actually very concerned about getting the coronavirus. And it's noteworthy, and we've seen this all along the way, whether it be vaccines or whether it be other questions on COVID, that men and women differ. And this is also an area where they differ. 40% of women currently say that they're concerned about getting the coronavirus, with 17% being very concerned. Among men, that's only 29% who are concerned, and about 1 in 10 who are very concerned. And so, yes, there are some differences, and that's very important to consider as we kind of emerge out of this pandemic. So another question, this one about midterm election. It appears that interest in voting in this year's midterm is lower at this point for midterms compared to 4 years ago. Are there any thoughts on why this might be the case? Well, I kind of touched upon it earlier that there are some kind of partisan differences there that are different than a year ago. But it could be also that, there are a number of other factors that might play a role here. We just had a recall in September that required people to vote on an election. So maybe perhaps they haven't kind of moved beyond that and into kind of the midterm role yet. This could be tied to the views among Democratic voters who don't necessarily seem to be as enthusiastic about voting at this time. There is with this aspect of kind of COVID malaise, where people are just kind of, dealing with the pandemic in their own different ways, and that thinking about it as something that's 7 months in the future, that in many ways they feel may or may not impact their lives, may just not be something that's kind of really causing a great deal of enthusiasm. And so I think those are possible reasons. We'll definitely be coming back to this issue and seeing how people may actually kind of increasingly see this midterm as important. So another question from the audience: does the survey provide any insights into how views on housing affordability or housing costs may vary between renters and homeowners? And so this is a great question. And it's interesting that while solid majorities of both homeowners and renters say that the affordability of housing is a problem in their part of the state, when asked about whether they have enough money to pay for their rent, we actually find that renters are twice as likely as homeowners to say that they're very concerned about being able to pay for the cost of their housing. And so while overall there's a kind of understanding or a sentiment that the affordability of housing is a problem among renters and homeowners, it really kind of comes down to having enough money to be able to pay for the housing. And notably, when asked about whether or not they would consider moving out of their part of the state, this question I touched upon earlier, we do find that just over half of renters, compared to 4 in 10 homeowners, say they have considered moving outside of their part of the state. And so, I think, hold on, one more question here just popped up. It's something I kind of covered, and it has to do with kind of whether or not Democrats will be able to hold the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, and whether or not our survey can point to anything. Well, as it seems at this point, Democrats are less likely to consider voting to be important at this time. We still find that 51% of likely voters say they would vote for a Democrat in their House race. This is similar to what it was in 2018. However, when we look back to 2020, we do find that, starting in May, so not quite at this time frame, we didn't ask about it in March 2020, but starting in May 2020, as well as in September and October, about 6 in 10 were saying that they would vote for the Democratic candidate. And so that's one thing that we'll have to continue to watch. As well as, we'll have to just continue to watch things that I think impact everyday voters, things like gas prices, things like rising consumer prices. And so these are things that I think are going to be increasingly more important as we get closer to the election, because if you do have a a Democratic president with a Democratic House of Representatives, as well as a tightly divided Senate, and there are all these problems. There's the overall notion that these problems might fall on the elected officials. And whether or not that's true about gas prices or any of these other things, that's the way perception is. And as we know in politics, as well as elsewhere, perception is reality when it comes to these things. So it looks like we have one more question. This is a great one. This is a great one that I think people often ask about when you're doing a media interview or not. And that has to do, is there anything that surprised you about the survey findings? I would say that one of the things that was surprising is the fact that we're seeing that this kind of divide between Republicans and Democrats on a number of topics, which are normal, but the fact that when it comes to voting in the midterm, normally I would think that if you're in control of the House of Representatives and Congress, you would think that continuing to control those would be important. But we did see this kind of fall among, or this lower level of importance among Democrats. And so that can change. And it does, I think, there's time for it to change. We're still 7 months away from the election, but that's something that will be continuing to watch. And we also, I do think we asked a number of questions on the recall process. And what I found interesting about this, and I highly encourage you to read Mark Baldessari's blog on this, which is now up on the PPIC's website. And I would say that one of the things that are interesting there is that, we asked about a number of reforms that were put forth by the Little Hoover Commission, and none of the reforms actually garnered majority support. These reforms were touched upon things like the number of signatures that you needed to put a recall on the ballot, the amount of time you had to collect signatures, as well as when you could actually institute a recall, whether it be too soon after you're elected or too close to your end of your term, as well as a real change to the way from a two-part election where you vote yes or no on the recall, and then you select a replacement, to what's called a snap election, where you're actually just able to put any replacement candidates as well as the person potentially being recalled on one ballot. And none of those received real strong support, basically between 42 and 48% support on those. But when we asked if these items should be placed separately on the ballot as constitutional amendments in the November election, we found that over half, and nearly 6 in 10 likely voters, actually said that they favor that. And so even though they didn't really have strong feelings towards any of the potential reforms that would be placed on the ballot, we do find that they would actually want to vote on this. And this is something that has been consistent with a lot of our research on the initiative process. They really want to have a say when it comes to the initiative process, whether that means balloting, ballot box budgeting, or whether it be any of these types of things that make it to the ballot. Californians really want to have a say, number one, and they think that the decisions, they've historically thought that the decisions they make at the ballot box are actually better than the one that the legislature have actually would make. And so I think that's interesting. I think that's something that all of you interested parties should definitely find that blog. And as I said, as well as the crosstabs and time trend information, we have that among all adults and likely voters. And so I think this is something that that if you're interested in politics or policy in California, you should definitely go take a look at that. And sadly, it seems as though there are no more questions. That's quite all right. I've talked quite enough, I'm sure. But we've reached the end of our program. I would like to once again thank our funders, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And if you like this, we have a couple of events next week. both looking at COVID in California. One in particular looking at what we've learned about education over the last 2 years, as well as another that looks at what we have learned about ensuring an equitable recovery as we come out of COVID. So both of these should be really interesting conversations. If you pre-registered for today's event, you will later today you will receive a survey. We really appreciate you taking the surveys, take a couple minutes to respond and let us know how we did. And at this, I would just like to say thanks for being here and please have a safe and good afternoon. Take care.